Welcome to Take a Seat, where we sit down with experts on a wide range of topics related to the science of human flourishing. Together, we're going to explore topics that can help us level up, give us hope, and maybe even make us feel optimistic about the future and our ability to live good lives both individually and collectively. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Holton. I'm a coach, consultant, and speaker in the field of optimal human functioning, but I'm most passionate about science and stories that can help us create a better system of education. Together with the Shipley School, a global leader in educating for flourishing, we're happy to have you join us. So take a seat. Hey, everybody. Welcome into Take a Seat. In December of 2020, just as the numbers surrounding the pandemic were starting to rise again, I had the opportunity to take a seat with author Lydia Denworth. Lydia is a woman of many interests and talents. She's written 3 books. She serves as a contributing editor to Scientific American, and she writes for outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Psychology Today. While her breadth of knowledge and experience made our conversation ripe for a variety of topics, this particular discussion centered around her latest work, the new best-selling book, Friendship, The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. You see, for a lot of us, relationships are incredibly underappreciated when it comes to thinking about human flourishing. Sure, most of us have a general awareness of the fact that we like other people and enjoy spending time with them. We may also appreciate the positive impact they have on our mood and overall happiness. If we're lucky, we know what it means to love a close friend. What most of us are not so aware of is that relationships, and more specifically friendships, are also tremendously important to our physical health, longevity, ability to face challenges and navigate adversity, and ultimately achieve our peak potential. Some of that is because the neuroscience of friendship is still relatively young, though, as Lydia told us, blossoming rapidly. So speaking with Lydia was an opportunity to dive into some of these topics with a true expert. Our conversation touched on the new findings from neuroscience that shows us the impact relationships have on us, even down to the genetic level. We touched on the different traits of positive, nourishing relationships, as well as the ambivalence that can often characterize some of our other friendships. Lydia walked us through the different ways we interact with friends and friendships throughout the various periods of our lives, and provide some thoughts on how we might better leverage these benefits of life's fundamental bond in young people through education. It was a really rich conversation. We had a lot of fun. It's filled with gems of thought for parents, professionals, or really just any person looking to sort of answer the call to level up to something better. So without further ado, take a seat. Here is our conversation on friendship with Lydia Denworth. Hi, Lydia. How you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. How are you, Nick?
I am very well, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, good to be here. You know what? I think I might lift this up. One more book. Hang on. all the jury rigging. Yes.
we literally just got done talking about how this, I just rigged it up on literally a stack of books.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll be happy to know that your book was not included in that stack. So.
That's all right. I wouldn't be offended. Yeah.
Let's start here. You've been a writer for a long time, more specifically a science writer, I think is how you might describe yourself, for a number of years. You've contributed to a bunch of different outlets, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Psychology Today, The Atlantic. There's a laundry list, right? And you're also a contributing editor for Scientific American, right? So you've got this rich history. You mentioned wanting to be a writer, I think for most of your life, it sounds like, right?
That's right.
And you've got all these potential topics to choose from and interests that you likely have, right? And outlets through which you can kind of publish writings about these interests. Why'd you choose friendship?
Because it just seems so interesting to me, so central to who we are and what we do. But also, I realized, the biggest reason was because I realized that there was a story about the science of friendship to tell that most people were not familiar with. So that's the challenge, was that friendship is something that everybody is part of everyone's life, so much so that we think we know all there is to know about it, and we don't. And, and scientists are guilty of this too. So my job as a science writer is to go out in the world and listen to scientists when they talk about what they're working on, what is interesting to them. And I especially find it interesting to listen to them talk to each other. And so I go to, in the before times, pre-COVID, I went to a lot of scientific conferences and listen to what they're working on. And I was really surprised about 5 years ago to discover that at a neuroscience conference, so, deep into the workings of the brain, they were talking about friendship. And really they were getting at this, both the biology and the evolutionary story of friendship. And those were things I didn't think that we appreciated about friendship. And so I thought that was a story worth telling, and that if you're going to write a book, you need to feel that it's a topic you could stay engaged in for a couple of years. And I thought, hey, I'm happy to think harder about friendship and make sure I'm doing it right, make sure my own friendship house is in order, all of that. So.
Yeah. There's two threads I'd love to pull on there a little bit. And one is, you mentioned, your job is to go out and understand what these researchers are saying. And so the logical question is, what are they saying? Right. We'll get to that in a minute. But you also mentioned, that, I guess the question is, was there a specific moment in time where you're like, yeah, friendship, that's the 2-year commitment? Or has it been sort of a collection of life experiences? It sounds like there's probably some moment of inspiration and commitment to the very large task of writing a book. Just curious what that was like for you.
Well, there was a particular conference on social neuroscience. I mean, it sounds very wonky, but I was there. I had finished my last book, I Can Hear You Whisper, which is the story really of discovering that my son is deaf and getting him a cochlear implant, but it weaves our personal story with what's happening in the brain with language and with sound and language, and then also some cultural history of the deaf world. And so that book really got me into covering the brain specifically. I got very interested of course, I have 3 kids. I was interested in child development, what happens in the brain, but I got interested in the brain more in a bigger way. And at the moment that I went to this social neuroscience conference, I had come sort of off of finishing that book. I was freelancing, but I was casting around for a book project. What would be next? I mean, that is one of the things you do if writing books is going to be a regular part of your work. And I really like the process of digging into one subject in more detail and getting to know the people who are working on it, and telling a story in a way that is different in a book than what you can do in magazines. And so I knew I thought I was interested in probably doing something connected to the brain. Social neuroscience was intriguing to me because it's a relatively new subspecialty. And, so taking, as it sounds like, social behavior and what's going on in the brain and looking more closely at that. And so, it seems logical that friendship would be part of that, but that isn't what mostly scientists have been studying. They've mostly been they study relationships between romantic partners. They study, mothers and babies. Those kinds of relationships are easier to define. They're easier to measure. And so friendship is sort of late to the party in terms of relationships that are going to get this deep dive from scientists. And so I would say that when I was at this social neuroscience meeting, I was liking the idea that there was something interesting to say about how the brain handles social behavior. But I didn't really know what I would do with that. And I got the idea that friendship could be interesting, but it did then take a while to come up with the book that exists today. There's a process, at least for me, it takes me quite a while to figure out what the core idea is going to be. At one point, I was looking at doing a much bigger book about a lot of different kinds of relationships, for which friendship might have been just a chapter. And then we sort of decided, my agent and I decided to flip that on its head and make friendship the big subject, and hang some of what we know about social behavior and other relationships on that.
It's so interesting. And I particularly like the insight you just mentioned that a lot of times friendship specifically as a particular form of relationship, the words you use are sort of late to the party, right? And generally, if I'm speaking about relationships, it's in a very general sense, right? Connection, belonging, love, intimacy, vulnerability, things of that nature, right? And you go to a much more specific or kind of finite level of granularity in the book that I think is incredibly useful. And also, you mentioned earlier, like, friendships are such an important part of all of our lives. It's a bit odd that the lines of research around it have been maybe kind of slower to develop than some other lines. Right?
Well, I think that it was often seen as kind of squishy and not a subject for serious scientists. And I mean, I alluded sort of to this a little bit, but it's probably worth drawing out this point, is that science requires measurement and outcomes, and it was hard to figure out for a long time what you would measure and how you would define friendship and what you would measure. And so part of the task of studying it in a more serious way was to do exactly that, to try to work out, well, what is it at its core? What is friendship? And how would we measure it? How would we measure the outcomes, that, the differences of what you get from it and what you don't? Some of it does get, so I think that the science of it has two interesting results. One is that we have got more clarity, and I'll come to that in a minute of what that definition is. But the other is that it's kind of blurring the lines too, though, because it's telling us more about, I see friendship now as a template for all other relationships. And I guess to explain what I mean by that, it's useful to talk about what the definition is. So the evolutionary biologists in particular, they actually working in other species, which is a big part of the book and a big part of what's interesting about the science, or where we've made the biggest strides, is in understanding that friendship or something like it exists in other species. And that tells us that even though we've known it's pleasurable for thousands of years, we always thought it was pretty much cultural, a kind of happy byproduct and of language and civilization. And seeing it in other animals tells us that there's something more fundamental going on. And so in those other animals, it's actually easier. You strip away more of the complexities that we have in human life, and it's easier to zero in on what exactly do these bonds contain. And so the answer is essentially three things: that they're stable and long-lasting, that they're positive, so that they make the individuals involved feel good, and that they're cooperative, so they are reciprocal. There's a helpfulness to friendship that's really important. And, we can talk about what all that looks like in like a baboon. Obviously, they don't make each other feel good by listening, oh, how was your day? They groom each other. That's literally physical. And they get oxytocin surging through their bodies and dopamine and other kinds of happy, neurotransmitters. Yeah. But the relationships are predominantly positive. So in humans, I think it looks like, well, first of all, let me say, there are a whole lot of other elements of friendship that people might have, or think of first, like trust and loyalty come up a lot. What I'm saying is that you need, at its core, to be a quality friendship, you need these three things. It's a relationship that's built over time. Even if you like each other the minute you meet, you need some time together to really build a rapport, and the trust and the sort of support mechanism that is important, and that it's positive, and that it's got this cooperative, helpful element to it. And by the way, let me just add that that scientists in other fields like anthropology and child development have also tried to look at what friendship is, and they've come up with very, very similar, the same themes reappear across fields, which is why I feel comfortable saying we could use this as a definition.
A couple things stand out to me here. One is, we were just talking about how you very beautifully kind of weave a historical account, right, of really the study of friendship, starting, with studies of different primates, right? Primarily, you can correct me on the verbiage here, monkeys, baboons, probably different types. You can tell I'm not a biologist, right? But, part of that history is probably skewed to more recent decades, in part because the science has advanced, right? Methodology has advanced. We can study things differently.
Yes.
The bigger takeaway, I think, is you started getting into, in the book, you mentioned qualities of good friendships, types of different relationships or friendships, positive, negative, and ambivalent. And you also even mentioned relationship styles, right? Independent, discerning, and acquisitive. Mm-hmm. And I still want to, get the general overview. I'm sure listeners probably got the spoiler, like friendships are really important.
Yeah.
Deal, right?
Yeah.
I think we can kind of create a nuance between, just wanting friends and now knowing through neuroscience and biological evidence, psychological evidence, we actually need them. Right.
Yeah, I think that's. Let's just do it. Let's make sure we hit this point. That yes, a lot of people would say, but we've already known that friendship is nice and that it matters and we care about it. All true, but exactly as you say, what this science shows us is just how deeply it goes, how it's under the skin. It gets into our molecular and cellular functioning, and so really the two big headlines of my book are these: that friendship over the long haul is as important for your health as diet and exercise. It affects how long you live, but but more than that, or within that, it affects your cardiovascular functioning, your immune system, your stress response, your sleep, your risk of dementia, your risk of depression, and your even the rate at which your cells age. And so it's not just friendship, of course, it's friendship at one end and loneliness or social isolation at the other, which are a continuum of measuring your level of social integration. The other big headline is that it turns out that there are really clear evolutionary advantages to being good at making and maintaining friends. And that's the stuff we see in the baboons and the macaques and chimpanzees, and that they live longer and have more and healthier babies if they have some good, strong positive bonds. And they don't have to be with relatives, even though baboons, for instance, do tend mostly to hang out with their relatives because that's who's around. What's interesting is that the exception proves the rule here, right? That the baboons who don't have family, because they get eaten by lions, unfortunate things like that.
Yeah.
When those baboons build relationships with non-relatives, and those relationships serve the same purpose. So that's what tells us that it's this template of the quality of the relationship that is the most important thing. So those are the two big headlines for why this really matters. And those are the things we did not fully understand until relatively recently.
Yeah. And, you mentioned, I'm so glad you brought up this spectrum, this continuum, because my next question was going to specifically be about loneliness. I mentioned the Lundstedt meta-analysis pretty much anytime I talk about relationships in general, right?
Right.
And it bears sort of repeating that, relationships, the presence of, are very good for us, and the absence of is also incredibly bad for us. Would you mind just kind of expanding on some of the research on loneliness a little bit more?
Yeah, so loneliness is actually where a lot of the research on friendship started, partly because, I mentioned the need to measure and to have outcomes, and
Yep.
Loneliness was a little bit more something you could grab onto and try to measure. You can also induce it in the laboratory. You can make people feel lonely by making them feel excluded and or hypnotizing them. And so it was beginning really in the 90s, this line of research started that was looking at the physiological ramifications of loneliness. And actually, I think it's helpful to even go back a little bit further, though, as I kind of trace in the book. Really, what I'm trying to do is show the story of an idea, the idea that relationships might really matter for our health. And so loneliness is a piece of that. But where it started was in the late 70s and 80s with sociologists and epidemiologists beginning to track people over long periods of time. Like a lot of people have heard of the Framingham Heart Health Study, for instance, which has existed for 60 years now, 70 years. At first, they were looking for risk factors for heart disease, for instance, in Framingham, and risk factors for other kinds of chronic disease in other studies. But they a few people added in some questions about people's social lives in those studies. And so, if you had thousands of people in a community, so in Massachusetts or in California, there were a bunch of them scattered around the country and around the world. You checked in on them medically every couple of years. You asked these questions about their social relationships, and nobody really thought, though, to compare those two things until several decades had gone by, or at least a decade, I guess. And in 1979, the first really important study came out that showed that in a study in Alameda County, California, people who at the start of the study in 1965 had reported being more socially integrated were less likely to have died 9 years later. And that's all that they showed, right? It's a correlation. So in science, it's very important to distinguish between a correlation, which is just that two things are both happening at the same time, but not necessarily that's causation, that one is not necessarily causing the other.
Right.
But so it was the first time anybody really noticed that, well, hey, wait a minute. It seems like social relationships help you live longer and vice versa. Not having them is a risk factor for dying. And so people started building on that. And in 1988, there was a really important paper in Science about this. That was the first time anybody linked smoking, the risk of smoking, with the risks of loneliness and isolation. And we've only just kept going since then. So the Lundstedt meta-analysis that you mentioned looks at the data on 3.5 million people just about. And the most powerful part of it takes very complex measures of social integration. I mean, back in the day when I was describing those first studies, it literally would be questions like, are you married? And, how often do you go to church or have a community that you see or something like that? How often do you see your friends and family? Mm-hmm. It's gotten much more sophisticated. And as it is, it's just built and built and built. It's confirmed that yes, social relationships really do have this effect on our health and on our longevity. And so now it's not just speculation. Now we do think that it's causation. And what Julia and Holt Lundstedt found is, essentially that depending on exactly what you're measuring, anywhere from there's a increase in the risk of dying earlier. You're about, let's call it an average of 30% more likely to die earlier if you're isolated, if you're lonely, isolated, or live alone. And I'll just add that what I think is really fascinating is that even when we figured out all of that, people thought, well, okay, that makes sense that you live longer if you've got friends, or you live with someone because, let's say you have a heart attack, there's someone there to drive you to the hospital, right? Recognize that you need to go and to take care of you. And that's true. That matters, and it is a real thing. It's known as social support, and it's important. But what we see, the reason that baboons are so important, and the macaques and all of that, is that baboons also live longer if they have more and healthier relationships, happier relationships, and baboons don't drive each other to the hospital, right? And
right.
So that tells us that there's something else going on, right? That this is getting, as I said, under the skin, which is the language that biologists use. It's changing the way our bodies respond, or that the way that we handle the things that happen to us. And so that is why friendship is so, so important. And now I've actually forgotten what your original question was. I'm sorry.
No,
I got carried away.
No, I mean, really, it all comes out of the question about loneliness, right? And reiterating just, like I said earlier, what a critical need this is. If you're looking across, now biology, neurology, humanistic psychology, positive psychology, you're going to find relationships in general listed as core needs, right? Like fundamental to well-being and to sort of a thriving existence.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things I think is really interesting about loneliness in particular is that we've come to see that it serves as a biological warning signal. So it is kind of the equivalent of hunger or thirst. Right. In fact, a study this year out of MIT, it's a preliminary report, but it came out ironically in March or February, March, just as everybody was going into pandemic shutdown mode. But they showed for the first time, and this has been a theory for a while, but they showed for the first time that deep in the brain, loneliness looks like hunger cravings, like that there's a very similar losing the word here, that they look the same in the deep in the brain, and that confirmed for the first time that yes, this really is an alert. It's a warning, and it's telling us that we actually have this physical need to connect. And this is also why loneliness, a little bit like stress, a little bit can be good for you and a lot is bad for you, right? And so a little loneliness is good for you because if it's serving as a signal and it says, gosh, I've been sitting around for a really long time and, just watching Netflix and I need to pick up the phone and call someone, or in the before times, I'm going to make a date and go out and see my friend. And if we do that, if we respond in that way and that we recognize the need to connect, then that's healthy and it's serving a purpose. It's when it's chronic and unrelieved, that it starts to build this unhealthy response in the body.
Right. And yeah, it's a great, comparison with stress, the difference between, just sort of like healthy stress. That same, Framingham study, I think, is elicited some interesting findings that people who live longest and tend to be healthiest and happiest, they don't lack stress. They have a presence of positive stress on some level.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It occurs to me as you're talking about the spectrum between loneliness and friendship or belonging or whatever you want to put on the other side of that. And you mentioned this in the book a little bit. There can be a dark side, a shadow side to that, right? Which is this like really deep need to belong. And what I'm thinking about is a term from Brene Brown, which is common enemy intimacy, right? And creating bonds and relationships that don't necessarily lead to really positive outcomes, right? But speak to this sort of human need. Do you care to comment on that at all? I mean, like I said, you weave it into the book a little bit, but how do we watch out for that, right? How do we guard against that, knowing that like this need is so deep and sort of evolutionary?
Yeah, I think we guard against it by recognizing it. One of the great things about being humans is that we're smart enough to counter some of our innate tendencies. Mm-hmm. And what that science that you're talking about tells us, it comes really out of the neuroscience of empathy, which is a big piece of friendship and social relationships. And it's something else that it's its own subfield where it has really come along in the last 20 years. And what we understand now is that, empathy is basically, it's actually a couple of different things, but It's mostly understood to be your ability to recognize that someone else has beliefs and values that are different from yours. That's theory of mind, it's also called, but then also to care, to have compassion maybe. So there's, and the thing is, though, that it turns out that in studying empathy, we've really discovered that there is this very, very strongly built-in kind of us versus them tendency that we have. And we even do it. So it's obvious. Look, in the state of the country in this election year, that there is a very clear us versus them dynamic going on in terms of the left and the right, and that where your cognitive biases sort of make you just so much more likely to believe the things that your side says, and even when other evidence would seem to plainly indicate that it's not true, and so but the thing is, like, we do this with people from other countries or people of other races or religions, but we also do it in the laboratory. If you bring people into the lab and you say, okay, you all are going to wear green t-shirts and be called the Eagles, and you all are going to wear blue t-shirts and be called the crocodiles or whatever it is, you will like start to feel this connection and empathy for the people on your team, this artificial team that the laboratory just made up, and you will not like the people on the other team, and you will really treat them differently. You will see them differently, and in your brain patterns will respond differently to the people on your team and on the other team.
I was just going to ask, you can see that even on like a neural signature sort of level, right? I mean, really, really granular.
You can see, yes. I don't ask me for the real details because it's been a while since I've read that literature, but yes, it's neuroscientists who are studying this and who are looking at how this works, but they're trying to apply it to, things like Mideast peace, and can we get Palestinians and Israelis to understand each other more? I feel like we don't have to go so far afield. We can do it here in our own country a lot. We need to. But yeah, so they're looking at what happens in the brain. But to get back to your critical question is, what do we do about it? Well, we recognize it, and then we can work to counter it. But we have to understand it on a pretty nuanced level, because it isn't as simple, for instance, as to say that if you get people from two sides, like Palestinians and Israelis together, and you just get them to know each other, that they will automatically think better. I mean, often that helps, but it also sometimes can end up having the reverse of what you want. It can make the Israelis feel more tied together, and vice versa for the Palestinians. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I think, this is one of the things that science sometimes tells us things about ourselves we don't really want to know. It's one reason a lot of the origins of the science of friendship come out of sociobiology, which was what E.O. Wilson, famously, the Harvard biologist, was one of the proponents of in the 70s. And there was a backlash at the time because it was this idea that, sociobiology suggested that our social behavior was, driven by our genes and our brains, and in a way that meant that we might not be able to control it. And the backlash at that time was sort of driven by a fear that, that means that the unpleasant things about society are unfixable, or that they're status quo, like racism or eugenics and the Nazis and things like that. Like are you feeding into that? But I don't think you are, and neither do most scientists today think that you are. It's that we need to recognize these things, but we also need to understand that then you filter them through culture and language and the wisdom that we humans have to do it better. And, it doesn't mean that it's not that simple, I guess is what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe, why don't we dig into the nuance of that a little bit more by spending a few minutes on kind of maybe the types of relationships. You really categorize them in three ways: positive, negative, and sort of ambivalent or mixed, I guess is another way of saying that. And I think, I think the obvious to anyone listening is like the positive friendship, the positive relationship, that's a positive thing. Like that's nourishing, right? And that helps in all sorts of ways. And the negative kind of does the opposite. But what I found really interesting was, some of the nuances on ambivalent relationships. Would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Sure. The important thing to say here is that a lot of us have friendships that all of these categories, so, and it's one of the things I think one of the takeaways here is that we need to pay more attention to the real quality of our relationships, of the people who are closest to us anyway. And if it's 100% good and, they do nothing but sustain my soul and make me feel good, that's going to be really good for my health. A toxic, fully negative relationship, hopefully we don't have that many of those, but and we do a pretty good job of getting rid of those people in our lives, but sometimes we don't. And sometimes we don't even quite see the toxicity. That is uniformly bad for you, and that's not a surprise. But yes, this question of ambivalent relationships, and it's worth getting into what that is. So this is a relatively new sort of set of studies, and so it's got a long way to go. So let's just caveat by saying, this, but the main guy who's doing this work is Bert Acino at the University of Utah. And what he does is he asks people to describe how they feel about their relationships on I think it's a 1 to 5 scale. And, how positive on all these things, how negative on all these things. And so for the people for whom we have both positive and negative feelings, they set a pretty low bar for calling it ambivalent, so that if you had, any measurable kind of negative feelings, even if you had a lot of positive feelings, that would be an ambivalent relationship. And of course, that turns out to cover like about half of our social lives. I mean, we don't, none of us are perfect, and we often feel ambivalent. We feel a lot of good things about people, but we also feel some negative things. And the thing that's so interesting is that the assumption has often been, well, we stick with these ambivalent relationships, and we think that the good must outweigh the bad, that, that they're worth having in our lives. And what Bert Acino has shown, and Julianne Holt-Lunstead also has done some of this work, who did that meta-analysis we talked about earlier, they are showing that ambivalent relationships are bad for your health. They're bad for your biology. And that's a little alarming if they make up half of our social life. And we're not just talking here about friends. It's also true of romantic relationships, family relationships. In fact, it's often more true of family relationships than it is of friendship, because friendship, of course, is seen as fundamentally a voluntary relationship. So you can get out of it. You can quit. I think it tells us, and Bert would tell you, it tells you that you sort of have choices about the relationships in your life. If you have a friendship about which you feel quite ambivalent, and that would be, I talk to a lot of people about their friendships, as you might imagine, and a lot people will talk about someone that they've known a really long time, with whom they have shared history or that they grew up with, but that they also find draining, and we rarely, we often feel that the pull of the shared history is what matters, and we don't always look at how we feel when we interact with that person today. When you do that and you sort of say, wait a minute, that maybe this relationship isn't so great, you have choices. One is to talk about it, to have the hard conversation that helps you repair the bonds, or talk about what you think is going wrong. Like maybe it's a lopsided relationship. So remember, my definition included the cooperative, reciprocal element of friendship. If you have a friendship where one person does all the talking and the other does all the listening, that's going to feel lopsided over time. And maybe it's worth talking about that. One of my best friends and I, whenever we have our check-ins on the phone, we do it. We call it like sharing the headlines, just to kind of make sure that each person's got their stuff out there. It's like, okay, give me your headlines. You give me your headlines. And then we sort of figure out, okay, well, I think yours really need dealing with today. And, mine are not so bad. So, or whatever.
Front page headlines. Yeah.
Front page. Exactly. And so, anyway, but that there's a very conscious making sure that you're going back and forth and that each person is getting some time. So either you have a conversation and you work to make the relationship better, or you decide that it's really not worth maintaining if it's one that you can get out of, One thing I think is happening, or is a way to go, is to kind of, we have these social circles that expand. You know, we have a couple people at the core, and then we have wider social circles of people we don't see as much. I would shuffle someone maybe further out into an outer ring, you know, because if they're not sustaining you or giving you the things you need, you got to limit the amount of time that you put into it. Doesn't mean that they don't belong in your life, and I know I say that, and it makes it seem very, very simple. I'm like, okay, do this, you know, and I know human relationships are messy, and, you know, nobody likes to hurt anybody else's feelings and all of that. But the message here is that you need to pay attention to what you get out of a relationship and a friendship, you know, and how you are. Like, maybe you're the problem, you know?
Right. Yeah. I really like the point you're bringing up, is that we can take intentional sort of approach-oriented behaviors to nurturing relationships, right? We don't have to sit back passively and just sort of, you know, have these avoidance behaviors where it's like, I'll do just enough to make sure I don't lose this person. That's not the same thing as consciously, intentionally acting in a way that will nourish and deepen that relationship. I also, you know, it's worth mentioning, I think, the rings you're talking about, because you mentioned this in the book, and this is kind of a common practice, especially in sociological work. These concentric rings are basically like the center is sort of your most important relationships, right? A lot of times you might see like your relationship with yourself at the center of that. And from there, you're going, you know, friends, family, like those closest relationships, and out to these different rings. And you mentioned earlier some of the divide, certainly in this country. I think a lot of it is like people have different rings, right? It's not that people are inherently evil in many cases. It's that the people that they care about that make up those different rings differ from maybe the folks across the aisle, or, you know, something along those lines, at least.
Yeah, although it's also true that one of the things, unfortunately, that's happened with this polarization in the country, this extreme polarization, is that there were people in your inner circle, like maybe it's a sibling or a parent who has a very different political view. And I think it has led to some real rifts.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is because shared worldview is one of the similarities that seems to matter the most. And so it matters the most in terms of feeling that real connection. And so I think I'm not suggesting that people need to give up the relationships with like family members or loved ones who have a different political view. But I do think that we have to be honest about how fundamental the differences are in how you're seeing the world now, the way it is. And yeah, maybe what you need, and it's interesting, that inner circle, the average is just 4 people that, you know, so it's not a lot of people. And it depends. Of course, it's highly variable by individual, but you could generally imagine it as about half biological relatives or your romantic partner. If you have a spouse, we hope that that spouse is in that inner circle, but then half friends. But some people it's all family, and some people it's all friends. But those, let's call them those 4 people. This is where the quality matters more than quantity. Quantity is not unimportant, but quality matters most. And so those 4 people really need to be fully on the positive side of the ledger for you. And that this is where the ambivalence is an issue, right? And then going out into the further circles, you don't need quite as much from those relationships. And that's a reason to put people there that you want to maintain a relationship with, but you don't, you need to make sure you're putting the bulk of your time into these people who are giving you the most bang for your health buck, I guess is one way to put it.
Yeah. Well, it's where the juice is worth the squeeze, right? And you speak to this to a certain extent when you reference the U-shaped curve. And, we're talking about like consciously, intentionally, maybe reshuffling your rings and thinking about who belongs where. But really, that's really considering how we're going to distribute our own physical, cognitive, emotional resources to the people around us, right? Yes. And this U-shaped curve, and I'd love for you to explain that a little bit. But it seems to me that as we age, we just get more picky about who we're going to spend those resources on, right? We sort of maybe, hopefully, if things go well, we kind of know who.
So there are two things at work. I mean, we recognize, or we actually, I'll say that we worry a lot about the oldest adults as being the loneliest, and in some cases they are, but it is also true that actually there's loneliness. Everybody reports being lonely, and in fact, and teenagers report very high levels of loneliness because their brains are so attuned to the social cues in the world and sensitive to acceptance and rejection. They're primed for feeling that more. But older adults, two things are happening. One is, yes, their social circles are getting smaller. People are passing away or getting ill, or, whatever it is, or they stop working and then they don't see all the people, the colleagues that they used to have. But it turns out that part of that is intentional, that older people have less time to put up with the crap. Yep. I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say on this podcast.
We're a cool podcast. You can say whatever you want.
And you don't put up with the bullshit, right?
Yep,
and you say, these are the people that I really want to spend my time with. And time, it's worth emphasizing how important time is when we're talking about friendship, that, you've got, and you mentioned the energy. It's about your emotional, psychic energy and your time that you're putting into the people that you care about and into your friendships, not just your family and romantic relationships. And when you do that, that's how you get a lot. The benefits, right, outweigh the costs, if you think of it that way. But older people are they've had time to figure out who they want to spend their time with and who they care about. And that's, so it's great when it's intentional. And I do think it's important. The reason I emphasize that is often, like, younger people see older people with smaller social circles and assume that it's all bad, or that that's not what they wanted. And it's important to say that there is sometimes this intentional process going on. It does mean, though, that we really do need to pay attention. I mean, in the pandemic, it's been really important to pay extra attention to thinking about whether someone who's older, who's alone, and is really, really limited in who they can see, and to make that effort to reach out that maybe you weren't doing before.
Yeah. So I married into a culture very different than mine, right? My mother and father-in-law are Vietnamese refugees. And as somebody who studies psychology, behavior, motivation, contentment, goals, orientations, all those sorts of things, it's been really fascinating for me to see how simplistically I was viewing a lot of those questions, right? Through a very, I think, sort of white American male lens in many cases. And you bring this up in the book, that a big issue with a lot of psychology, and positive psychology is certainly subject to this, is problematic because so much of it is done on, I love this acronym, weird societies. Right? So, I'd love for you to explain the weird acronym, but my general question is, you grew up, I think, mostly in Philadelphia. You've lived in New York, Brooklyn for a long time, but you were in France, you were in London, you were in Hong Kong. You're studying neuroscience and social neuroscience specifically, and a lot of biology in some cases, right? But I imagine you must be seeing some cultural differences in how we think about or relate to or deal with friendships. Has that been the case as you've sort of done a lot of your research?
Yes, although, so a couple of things. First of all, let's define our terms. So weird is Western educated, I'm spacing on what the I is, rich and developed countries, and Western countries, right? And so the great majority of research in all of science, but especially in psychology and things like that, is being done with those kinds of subjects and in those kinds of countries. So that raises, obviously, the problem that is not the majority of the world's population. But when it comes to friendship, I think it's important to say that there are certain differences in species or in individuals can be tied to biology. Differences in groups are tied to culture more. And so there's certain things about friendship and this science that we don't need to worry about, like the things we're learning from the baboons and that's going to be universal. It's going to apply to all human beings, right? Because our brains are built in the same way. We've evolved in the same way. The differences in friendship that are cultural are interesting. And I didn't get into this in great detail in the book, partly because I just said there's so much you could possibly talk about with friendship that I had to keep somewhat narrow focus. But one of the really interesting things that I found is, so there's an anthropologist named Dan Hrushka at Arizona State University, who's one of the few anthropologists who's really looked heavily at friendship. And he's done a couple of things. He's someone who went out looking for definitions of friendship across the many, many different cultures of the world. And I sort of referred to this briefly when I was talking about the definitions, but he found 4 things that were common, that sort of rose most often to the top as defining friendship in whatever culture you're talking about. And these would be really different, not at all weird cultures, but everybody. And they were the similar kinds of things, that friendship makes you feel good, it's positive, that it's about helping, especially in times of need. So that cooperative reciprocal element. And then interestingly, though, the one piece that, does not happen with baboons and other species is that he also found that gift giving was one of the top 4 themes with friendship, which at first made me think, we humans are pretty shallow. It's like what we really care about is getting presents from our friends. But it's not that at all, because the presents are often don't have great monetary value,
Right.
What they are is a way of marking the value of the relationship. And so that is, and that's a really important element that you see repeated all over the place. The other thing that Dan did that he's written about that I thought was really interesting is that he's taken a whole bunch of research on across, let's say, 30 different cultures. They they posed a philosophical problem, the passenger dilemma. I'm sure you've read the books, but you're probably familiar with this anyway.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so that you're riding in the car, you're the passenger, your friend is driving, and they're speeding, and they hit a pedestrian. Do you tell the police officer that your friend was speeding, or your friend asks you to lie? Do you lie to protect your friend, keep your friend out of jail or out of trouble, right? And the answer varies dramatically by country, by nation. Like the U.S. and Switzerland we're not very likely to lie to protect our friends. And in like Venezuela, they were much more likely to. I want to say 8 out of 10, maybe, versus 1 out of 10. I'm forgetting the exact. And maybe France and Japan were like 3 out of 10.
And you tie that to security on some level.
Right. So what this gets at, or what Dan thinks it gets at, is that he then compared those results with studies about the level of economic insecurity and political insecurity in countries, and found that in places where there is less security, less wealth, you are more likely to lie for your friend, and vice versa. And so, the suggestion is that it means that if your relationships have to give you, like, if that becomes a more important part of how you get through your life, right? How you cope, if you need your friends in a way that goes above and beyond just the sort of emotional needs that we have, but is like more built into the society's structure, then that's going to trump law and order, right? And then, or vice versa.
Which is evolutionary on some level, right? Like this is part of the reason why we're primed with neurotransmitters that say like, hey, bridge out and make connections. It doesn't just feel good. It's you mentioned earlier, it's more likely to, or increase the likelihood that we'll get some kind of evolutionary success, right?
Yes, exactly. And so, I mean that they need to do a whole lot more work on that,
Sure.
but it raises these really interesting questions and is a provocative way of thinking about what the role friendship serves in a community, and therefore what we get used to. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, it would be interesting to see that if you take let's say you take that Venezuelan and you put them in Switzerland for a while, would their behavior change,
Yeah.
in the environment, or would it never really change? And so for it to really be natural selection acting, as a pressure, you would need to see it continue. And we don't know if we would.
Yeah, there are lots of really, I think, interesting implications on natural selection, evolution, kind of what's advantageous and what's not.
Right.
Which, is in part, and this'll, I want to be respectful of your time. This'll bridge us, I think, into maybe our final question or two here. But, ultimately, we got connected because I'm here at the Shipley School. You're an alumni, and a prestigious alumni at that, right? And we're trying to think about there's plenty of people out there, I think, that have the common feeling that school or education can be done better, right? And so for us, what does that mean? Okay, achievement, sure, on some level, but what does achievement mean? And what you're bringing up here and what you've brought up in the book is that, achievement in many ways can be thought of through a social lens, all right? Or social mechanisms are an important part of it.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly see the implications on sort of the other two sort of legs of our stool, which, in addition to achievement, is individual well-being and collective well-being, right? Huge implications on both of those. So, I got to ask, how can we do a better job of teaching about and creating and fostering friendships in school settings, given how important these processes and these outcomes are to all people? But you mentioned it earlier, especially to young people. I think the exact line from the book is that rejection never stings as much as it does, in adolescence or in your teen years.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm actually I'm writing something right now that is a sort of continuation of the ideas that are in the book. I think so. I'm going to zero in on adolescence because I think that is where this is most critical. But the important understanding is that adolescence, from a neuroscience point of view, begins at around 10 and goes all the way into the mid-20s. It starts at puberty and at the very beginnings of puberty, and it goes all the way until you kind of are adopting a adult social role. And so, even a fourth grader or a fifth grader is just at the front of that. And there's differences in when people start puberty and things like that. But so that period of time, I mean, this well, and I'm sure many, many people in the education world are very familiar with the fact that the last kind of 15 years or so, we have really changed our understanding of what the adolescent brain is going through. Adolescents are not small children and they're not big adults. They are their own unique thing, and their brains are growing and changing in a way that rival is second only to the kinds of dramatic changes we see in very early childhood, 0 to 3. And the most important thing that's happening is their attention to the social world. They're trying to work out both their sense of self and how they relate to others. They are, yes, their sensitivity to social acceptance and rejection will never be higher. Their awareness of social cues and their concern with the social world is dramatic, and it drops off when you hit adulthood. You don't respond in the same way to the same kinds of signals, and it's the reward system in your brain that is in high gear to respond to social rewards and social cues. And the thing is, traditionally, of course, we've seen adolescence as this difficult time. We always were talking before about what's wrong with teenagers. And by the way, the reason I usually use the word adolescent is because it goes from 10 to 25. We're not just talking about 13 to 19, right? So, but we do complain all the time about teenagers, and they're impulsivity and their risk taking, and just how difficult they can be to deal with if you're an adult, because they don't seem to be seeing and thinking about the world in the way that you are. But that's exactly the point, right? They're not. And they're not meant to. I mean, what I think one of the great contributions of neuroscience here is that it has helped us to see that adolescence is its own developmental phase, and that the things that adolescents are doing are evolutionarily designed, right, to help them make that break from the protection of the family into having an independent life. That's my, that part. But the part that I think is really interesting is that now social neuroscientists and psychologists have begun to think that adolescence represents a sensitive period for social and emotional learning. So a sensitive period would be, a window of opportunity when the brain is especially primed, right? But that might end. Now, that's a little controversial. It's not fully established, but there was just a paper last year in mice showing very clearly a sensitive period for a certain kind of social learning that, peaks at around what's the equivalent in humans of about the age of 14, and closes in adulthood. And it's like all of the information is going past you. I mean, actually, interestingly, so like young male animals are fully capable of smelling females or the sexual hormones, things like that. Like they get the signals are there, the information is there. They're just not paying attention until puberty hits them. And then those cues take on a new salience, and then they are more rewarding as well to the brain. That's what's happening with kids in school. And I feel like too much of what we do in school is still kind of fundamentally sees a lot of times the friendships between kids as a problem. We're focused on when they're disruptive, when they're talking, when they're, when they're
playing
getting
video
into
games.
Trouble.
As you mentioned in the book. When
they should be on their laptop doing schoolwork, or they're playing video games together in ways that adults can't relate to. And instead, what we should be doing is looking for the ways that we can build on and take advantage of their heavy-duty interest in social things to make things better in the classroom. I haven't quite figured out exactly what that looks like. I mean, partly because my job, I see it as to sort of raise the questions, and then people like you who are on the ground in the classroom might be able to help me with the concrete, what does this mean? But one thing it means is collaboration and things like that, which is something a lot of people have been shifting to. It also helps to explain why Zoom learning is so terrible for a lot of kids, because they are learning as much from each other as they are from the adults. And on a Zoom call, that is a much harder thing to achieve, I think. It's not just the way they learn from each other when they're actively working together in groups, although that's obviously really important. And of course, they can do that in a breakout room, but it isn't the same. We know this. But there's also a whole lot of incidental learning that they're getting from each other, from the dynamic of being in the classroom. And so, I mean, to me, it's like one of the reasons why neuroscience would say that this is why trying hard to keep schools open during a pandemic is really important, because there's something extra going on that you cannot replicate. And so, I won't keep going, because I don't yet have the really concrete ideas for what it means in terms of how people operate in the classroom. But I think we start by looking for the positive opportunities and the ways to take advantage of this, and to understand that kids really care about things like status and respect, and making a contribution actually seems to be something that they really value, and it feeds into their sense of self. And so if you can hit them with the right positive experiences at the right time, you can put them on a more positive trajectory.
Leverage biology, leverage neurology, leverage
exactly.
Developmental psychology, right?
Exactly.
And our previous episode we had on Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and we were talking a bit about transcend, and which is obviously for a psychologist fascinating. Dr. Kaufman revisits, Maslow's not actual pyramid of needs, as he mentions in the book. But so, we talked a lot about purpose and sense of connection, and how do you often access purpose or meaning? A lot of times it's through other people, individual people or organizations or groups or teams or communities.
And it's not something we've kind of done this for kids. But, and I think this is why, I'm sure this is happening at Shipley now. I'm not familiar with exactly how it works, but at my kids' school here in Brooklyn, things like community service have become a very different, enterprise. It's not just about racking up some hours, and, they're really trying to make it part of the curriculum and really trying to find things that kids connect to on their own and that they really care about, where that sense of contribution and of having value and of having a sort of meaning for yourself and your community can all sort of come into the fore. And I think that's great. So I think probably educators, good educators are already doing these things or trying or thinking about it, paying attention. It takes a long time for stuff to work in the real world, right? And to really take hold.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. So Lydia Denworth, the book is Friendship, The Evolution, Biology, and Extraordinary Power of Life's Fundamental Bond. It's excellent. I loved it. I've recommended it to dozens of people already who I hope are digging into it and reading it.
I thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about where folks can find you? You've got 2 other books on very interesting topics, and it looks like you've done quite the podcast circuit lately. And made some other appearances. Where can we find you?
Well, the center of all things is my website, which is lydiadenworth.com. And from there, you can find links to a lot of my journalism and my appearances in various places. And certainly you can find information on all of my books, and especially on friendship.
Terrific. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate the time and the content and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Our show is produced by the Shipley School, an independent pre-K through grade 12 day school, rethinking education and daring to hope that we can, in fact, build a better future. I'm Nick Holton, and I'll be your guide through these conversations. Come on and join us.